has got the glossed words on. So I suggest before you move on to annotate each page, you just pause this video and just check through those ideas and terms. This is Act 1, Scene 1 of Othello. Just so you know the way that these texts work, the preceding page for each section of text. Okay, so the play opens in medias res, that idea of coming into the action halfway through. You're halfway through a conversation, and that's between Rodrigo and Iago. Now, what you make of those characters, and in fact the approach you take to the whole play, will in some way possibly be affected or influenced or coloured by the syllabus you're studying. So, for example, if you are studying AQA Spec A, that is Love Through the Ages, and it requires you to consider the text through the literature of love and contextually look at those archetypes. Lit B takes a similar approach, only this time through the lens of tragedy. There is inevitably some significant overlap between those two approaches. If you're doing a different specification with a different exam board, it may well be that both of those things are relevant to you and you're studying the play in general. So looking at this, you should have a fairly good grasp of the idea of iambic pentameter, blank verse, verse drama, and the kind of conventions of that. And if you haven't, I suggest you do maybe a little bit of reading around that so you're aware of what that can signify. It's also set in Venice, and you need to consider the connotations of Venice to a Jacobean audience. Venice was a part of Italy, a kind of authority in its own right, a kind of province in its own right, which was thought of as being very well governed, very well ordered, but also had connotations of sophistication, and that kind of not just meaning that in a positive way, in the way that we'd think about it, but meaning it in a way that it was kind of worked upon. It wasn't natural, it was kind of slightly overworked, if you like. The Venetians were thought of as being very sophisticated in the sense of maybe not entirely trustworthy through their kind of refined manners or so. And that also played into this idea of sexual liberation or immorality or lasciviousness. So just looking at this kind of note here. So in choosing Venice for the setting, Shakespeare is doing two things. He's establishing the setting as one that is civilized, ordered, sophisticated, but also with that element of sexual liberation behind it. That's going to come in critical later in the play, because Othello's doubts about Desdemona are enforced and reinforced by Iago, by being able to point to that idea of Venetian women and saying, you know, I know the women round here, you don't, you're an outsider. So the opening of the play begins with Iago's deception and the idea that he has deliberately manipulated or withheld information from somebody who is meant to be able to trust him. And Rodrigo as an archetypal character, and if you think an archetype as being the model of that kind of character in this kind of drama, Rodrigo is a gull, is a fool in not the kind of jester sense, but he is the silly gentleman, the lovesick gentleman who is not actually going to get anywhere in his suit because he is too sort of feeble, too wishy-washy, too silly, really. And you can tell, first of all, with the power dynamic from this opening exchange, where Rodrigo says, I take it much unkindly that thou, Iago, who hast had my purse as if the strings were thine, should know of this. So just in that opening, you get the idea that Rodrigo is paying Iago more than handsomely. Iago has complete and unfettered access to Rodrigo's finances in order to try and get Rodrigo what he wants, and yet Iago has withheld information. And Iago, as a kind of villain, as a archetypal kind of tragic villain, is going to control the flow of information throughout the play. And this is the very first example of him doing it. And Iago's initial comments, blood, so God's blood, you wouldn't get God's blood as a exclamation, as a curse past the censor, so it had to be contracted. But you will not hear me. If ever I did dream of such a matter, abhor me. And this is interesting because Iago has this tendency throughout the play to offer things that are insubstantial, ideas, concepts, doubts, and insecurities as concrete information. And here he offers to Iago, if ever I dreamt of it, then you're allowed to hate me. I had no idea. And later you'll see in the play that Iago will potentially fabricate a dream as a critical piece of evidence that he offers to Othello. So it's ironic that he starts with this concept of, you can absolutely trust me, and here is my evidence for trusting me. Rodrigo not only refers to a kind of incident that the audience doesn't know about, so that you should know of this, but also to somebody. So thou toldst me, thou didst hold him in thy hate. So we have a previous conversation, we have Iago saying that he hated somebody. And Iago's response to that, despise me if I do not. So, will hate me if I don't. Iago is already kind of being presented as in this space between the truth and deception. He's saying one thing and seeming to do something else. And he explains that 3 great ones of the city in personal suit to make me his lieutenant oft cap to him, and by the faith of man I know my price, I am worth no worse a place. So there has been some sort of promotion, and 3 significant people in Venice have visited this as yet unnamed him to persuade him of Iago's worth for some sort of promotion. They have off-capped to him, they have kind of respected him, made representations to him. And Iago says, I'm worth no worse a place, I know my price. Iago is going to talk the language of commerce and materialism all the way through the play. And he establishes this unknown him as somebody who has gone his own way despite advice. So this is a public figure, in establishing the public governance and the private interest ideas, despite being told by 3 people of excellent reputation and merit in the city that he should do something. This unknown him, who is Othello, has gone his own way. Now, in the play, there is a recurring idea of public interest and private interest. This is a domestic tragedy, the tragedy of 2 lovers, if you like, but set against the background of an interruption, a disruption to state governance and order. So Othello has apparently followed his own pride and his own purpose and evaded these people. He is horribly stuffed with the epithets of war, and none suits my mediators. So we're getting a picture as an audience of a man who is in command but is not commanding effectively, is listening to his own views over the accepted wisdom, and is maybe bragging, is maybe boasting a bit. And Shakespeare here has chosen to introduce you to Iago first and let you hear from Iago first, and let you hear from Iago in a way that, if this were true, is quite reasonable. The charm of Othello, or of Iago rather, and the efficacy, the effectiveness of Iago's plot and Iago's dealings with people is that they trust him. And as an audience, we hear from him first, and arguably we trust him first, because we haven't met Othello at this point. We just have Iago's words for it. And interestingly, the points that he picks up on are points maybe that Othello is not free from criticism about. And that's something you may have to kind of gauge when you're looking at Othello as a tragic hero, Othello as a lover. To what extent is he guilty of that idea of pride and following his own purpose? Look at later his wooing of Desdemona, pitching the idea of the Othello music, that confident, lyrical, sort of poetic account that he gives to the Senate of his wooing of her and their relationship, versus the idea of, how you actually talk about your own achievements, how you present yourself. But going back to line 15 and 16 and the idea of he non-suits my mediators, and he says, I have already chosen my officer. And Iago moves on to criticise the person who got the job, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine. Okay, and he uses Cassio's idea of the theory as a criticism, as an insult. He's a great arithmetician. He's trying to say that he's not somebody who knows the practice of war. He never set squadron in a field, nor the division of battle knows more than a spinster. He argues that Cassio has no practical experience, and then goes to put it over his own practical experience. But also he sets Cassio up as an outsider. He is a Florentine, not a Venetian. And this was a time when actually Florence and Venice were great rivals in terms of their success, and Venice had the edge. So Cassio is coming in as an outsider. Othello is obviously another outsider. And he says there's, unless bookish theory, unless bookish theoric, wherein the Toad Councils can propose as masterly as he, he's all book learning. He's no practical experience. He is mere prattle without practice. And if you're close reading, you can pick up on the kind of plosive alliteration there, giving that hint of disdain, giving that kind of sneering criticism of Iago. He's prattle without practice, and that's all his soldiership. But he, sir, had the election, and I of whom his, so Othello's eyes had seen the proof at Rhodes, at Cyprus, on other grounds, Christian and heathen, must be belied and be calmed by debtor and creditor. Okay, so Othello has seen what I am all about. He has seen me in action on the battlefield in these places, and I must be the one who stands back. Iago also talks the language of commerce, the language of value quite a lot. He's already said, I know my price. He's now talking about debtors and creditors. We know that he is controlling Rodrigo's finances. And he says, I must be the countercaster, the imposter, the kind of outsider, Cassio, must be his lieutenant, and I his moorship's ancient. Okay, so looking at the idea that Iago holds a position much lower, despite what Iago says is his superior service and superior experience. And just make sure that you have made a note of either the time that this glossary is at, or that you've just skimmed through it for the next set of meanings. Okay, so Rodrigo is very simplistic. He says, well, by heaven, I would rather have been his hangman. I would rather have got rid of this guy than serve either one of them. So straight away, that idea of revenge and physical violence is there. And it's interesting if you look at the background of kind of revenge tragedy at this period. Iago is setting himself up in a lot of ways as a revenger. But he is not your archetypal revenger. He's not your traditional or conventional revenge figure. In a nutshell, kind of the revenger of Elizabethan Jacobean revenge tragedy had to have been wronged in a way that removed his recourse to justice. So superficially, if we're accepting what Iago says, then he has been slighted, and there is no sense, no cause of justice or no retribution for him, because the ill has been done to him by somebody who's in charge. And if you look at revenge tragedy of this period, then that is one of the conventions, that actually it is a corrupt state or a corrupt government that has wronged the revenger. So he can't seek redress in the law. He has to take matters into his own hands. And that's the kind of course of action that Rodrigo kind of almost implicitly recommends by going through this idea of, you know, I would rather have been his hangman. But Iago seems to be quite pragmatic at that point, seems to be quite sensible. Well, there's no remedy, 'tis the curse of service. You know, it's the deal when you are in the military. Preferment goes by letter and affection, not by old gradation, where each second stood heir to the first. So there is not a meritocracy, there is not a level of succession that's defined fairly. It's all nepotism. It's all this idea of kind of the old boys network, if you like. Preferment goes by letter and affection. And he invites Rodrigo to think about what he said and say, sir, be judge yourself whether I in any just term am affined to love the more. Okay? Two things for that. First of all, the idea of judgment comes in. And this is a play which deals with the idea of judgment and flawed judgment and unreliability of judgment. And straight away he's saying to Rodrigo basically, listen to me, take all of your evidence from me, only listen to me, and then make your judgment. In a lot of ways, what Iago does to Rodrigo is kind of almost testing ground, is foreshadowing how he manipulates Othello. And this is one of the first instances, even in the opening lines. You know, he says, listen to what I've said, now judge. And of course, that's not the right way. There are instances later in the coming scenes where the Senate and the Duke show the right way to listen. You know, there's no composition in these reports. You actually get the idea that, well, we need more information. We need to balance these accounts. We need to look at all of our sources and then decide what's happening with the Turkish fleet. We need to hear not only from Brabantio, we need to hear from Othello, we need to hear from Desdemona, then we will make a decision. Iago is very much taking the operation of being the sole voice in everything. And twice now Iago has referred to Othello as the Moor. Okay, you might want to do some contextual reading about Elizabeth I's edict against the blackamoors. If you Google that, that will give you some idea of the context of this play. And just remembering that actually this was not an idea that the Jacobean audience would not have seen anybody of a darker skin colour, and nor is it actually the fact that that Othello would have been portrayed on the Jacobean stage as being a black character. He could have been, you know, kind of dark complexion, could have been Arabic looking, could have been, you know, black haired, as it means. But there is this idea of otherness about him, the idea that he is an outsider, and that Iago is going to play on that. There's also the concept that Venice as a state and a stable, well-run state is relying on Othello to preserve that order. And therefore is relying on somebody who is an outsider to them. And Iago, with that apostrophe, that idea of it says, Sir, content you, I follow him to serve my turn upon him. So he's saying I'm only with him to actually revenge myself. We cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. So Iago has this tendency to speak in contrasts, to pit concepts against each other, to reverse the usual order of things. And he says, actually, you know, masters, we can't all be the masters, and masters aren't truly followed. There is that disruption to order. It says, you shall mark many a duteous and knee-crooking knave that, doting on his own obsequious bondage, wears out his time, much like his master's ass for naught but provender, and when he's old, cashiered. Whip me such honest knaves. So he uses the example of the old donkey That you'll see people round who, treat themselves like donkeys. They give all of their years of dedicated service, and actually they get retired for nothing. They are worse than nothing. I'm not going to be one of those. Whip me an honest knave. By implication, I am not honest. And then he says, others there are who, trimmed in their forms and visages of duty, yet keep their hearts attending on themselves. So you've got this idea of appearance and reality, the idea of facade, the idea of duplicity, being something you are not. He says you can trim your form and your outward face of duty and keep your heart attending for your own purposes, so serving yourself. You throw but shows of service on the Lord, you thrive by them, and when they've lined their coats, do themselves homage. These fellows do themselves have some soul. So these people like that who are working to line their own coat pockets, they are the ones who I'm with. They have something about them. And such a one do I profess myself. So this is prefiguring his comment, I am not what I am. There is a difference between Iago's appearance and his reality that is taking in every single character. Ironically, although he is telling the truth to Rodrigo, Rodrigo is still being fooled by him, because Rodrigo is subject to this sort of double bluff by Iago that says, I'm telling you the truth, therefore you can trust me. But actually Iago is manipulating Rodrigo as much as, or more than anyone else at this point. So he says, were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. Well, yes. Iago is very fond of coming up with these apparent adages, apparent sayings that, kind of don't really bear much scrutiny. They sound very clever, but they're either quite obvious or they're incomprehensible. He says, in following him, I follow but myself. So in serving him, I'm serving my own means. Heaven is my judge. Not I for love or duty, but seeming so for my peculiar end. For when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart in complement extern, 'tis not long after but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve for doors to peck at. I am not what I am. So ironically, Shakespeare has Iago tell you, the audience, his plan at the very opening of the play. I'm not who I seem to be. I'm going to put on this idea of love and duty, and when my outward action does actually demonstrate what's in my heart, when my appearance and reality meet together, then, I'll wear my heart on my sleeve, I'll take the consequences, I will, be open about it. But for the meantime, I am not what I am. And in effect, that is what happens. The two come together, he's found out and exposed. And then Rodrigo kind of shows the casual racism of the time in terms of the, what a full fortune does the thick lips owe if he can carry it thus. Rodrigo and Iago are going to, in this scene, play significantly on that idea of the fear of what Othello represents. And we get back to the idea of what's been going on. Iago is a man of action, Rodrigo is looking for direction. So Iago says, call up her father. Okay, so whatever has gone on involves not just a him, but also a her. We're going to realise that actually Othello and Desdemona, Brabantio is the father, and is a senator. Brabantio's daughter has secretly married Othello, and Rodrigo is in love with her, with Desdemona. So call up her father, rouse him, make after him, poison his delight, proclaim him in the streets, incense her kinsman. So the idea that Iago is dealing with disruption, the idea that he's dealing in ambiguity, the delight that's going to be poisoned could be Brabantio's, could be Othello's. He's after hurt and humiliation, and he wants to kind of disrupt. And though he in a fertile climate dwell, plague him with flies. So we're getting imagery to do with disruption, distortion, tainting, corruption, suffering, And actually, says, even if his joy is joy, throw some changes of vexation on it, as it may lose some colour. So let's go and ruin everything. Let's go and poison pleasure. And that is what Iago is going to set to do in terms of this marriage. He's going to poison this relationship. Rodrigo and Iago get to Brabantio's house, and Iago is kind of egging him on, supporting him, saying, go on, wake them up. Shout as if there is a fire, and people need to be awoken because of that. And through this section, Rodrigo is kind of holding back slightly, and Iago is trying to whip things up, trying to incite upset and riot. Rodrigo is a gentleman in that kind of sense. Iago is far more vulgar, far more crude when he needs to be. So if you're looking at kind of the way that Rodrigo does it, Brabantio, Signor Brabantio, Iago, when you see this on stage, and bearing in mind that this is a play, so you should be thinking of kind of entrances, exits, how it's working in front of you. Iago should be hiding, because Iago would be known to Brabantio. So Iago can't risk that connection being made. So a lot of the time on stage you get Rodrigo standing shouting up to a balcony, and Iago hiding below or hiding underneath, maybe disguising his voice, generally kind of throwing out these invectives and this vulgarity. And Iago again, you can see, uses the language of commerce and kind of material loss to frame his argument to Brabantio, to really upset Brabantio. He uses a metaphor that Desdemona has been stolen, that Othello has effectively robbed him, and that fits into sort of two things. It fits into Iago's mindset in terms of material gain and profit and manipulation, but it also fits into those contextual points that you'll be aware of the status of women within society, in terms of that passage of going from your father and your father's responsibility and allegiance to your husband's, that actually Brabantio has lost something that he could legitimately expect to have control of. And Iago says at line 80, look to your house, your daughter and your bags. And he in doing that, he lists Desdemona as a kind of material possession. Brabantio appears, and Rodrigo is still again trying to take a sort of slightly more discreet version of it. Signor, is all your family within? So asking rhetorical questions to try and prompt him to realise that something's missing. Iago carries on his theft metaphor, because he wants to say, you are robbed, for shame put on your gown. And then if you look at the imagery that Iago uses, it's all graphically sexual, bestial imagery, so imagery to do with animals, and racist and ageist, in terms of it is really kind of emphasising difference and the idea of this unnatural union that Iago is going to use to frame his arguments. So the idea that an old black ram is topping your white ewe, he's emphasising both the age and the race difference. And he says, you've got to do something, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. So wrapped in with all of that is this idea of bloodline, is this idea with nature and unnatural, bearing in mind that at the time, sort of the idea of things being natural were also things being kind of condoned by the Christian faith. So it's kind of against religion, it's against nature. And Iago is really trying to use inflammatory language to get Brabantio as riled up as possible, as inflamed as possible. Rodrigo is recognised by Brabantio, and in that he's also confirmed as in the kind of unwanted suitor, because Brabantio says, the worse a welcome if you're called. Rodrigo, I have charged thee not to haunt about my doors. In honest plainness, thou hast heard me say my daughter is not for thee. Okay, so he has clearly tried a couple of times to kind of ply his suit to Desdemona. Okay, and Rodrigo is unable to kind of counter Brabantio's wrath at this point, and the fragmentation of his language, his kind of reluctance to kind of, or his inability to speak to Brabantio at the top of this page, establishes Brabantio as a man of importance and means. He has significant influence, and Brabantio talks in kind of threats and imperatives. Thou must needs be sure, my spirit and my place have in them power to make this bitter to thee. So he's kind of pulling rank, if you like. He wants to know what's going on, and Rodrigo is not being, you'll see this note, Rodrigo is not being duplicitous. He believes that, you know, this awful thing has happened that Brabantio will want to know about. You'll notice in terms of Iago's speech, he drops into prose as his language gets more coarse, more vulgar, and it also kind of shows his profanity and his frustration. You know, things aren't moving quickly enough for Iago. He's extending that bestial metaphor in terms of saying, look, if you don't stop this, your daughter is going to give birth to animals as a result of this union. The phrase, the idea of the beast with two backs has become really famous, okay, as a kind of term for sex, and Brabantio is kind of not quite struck dumb by this, but can only say, thou art a villain. You know, this idea is shocking and horrific to him, and Iago's response. And that kind of shared line is hemisticomythia. You can call it a shared line. That response is kind of, thou art a villain, you are a senator. Okay? And in terms of what is he reminding Brabantio of? Is there a kind of idea of power and corruption? Is there an idea of kind of, come on, use your influence, go and sort this out? Okay? And Rodrigo has got a little bit more of his wits about him, and fills in the explanation, says, I will answer anything, but I beseech you, you know, go and check, is your daughter within? And if she isn't, then you'll realise that she is now within the gross clasps of a lascivious Moor. So emphasising that idea of the sexual immorality that he's attributing to Othello by means of his race, and emphasising his race. And he says, okay, if this be known to you, line 127, and your allowance, if you've allowed this to happen, with the implicit criticism there, then we've done you bold and saucy wrongs. You know, we have seriously done you wrong by getting you up in the night. But if you don't, then, you know, look at what's gone on. Your daughter, and this is line 133, your daughter, if you have not given her leave, I say again, hath made a gross revolt. Okay, so has continued this awful rebellion. She's tied her duty, beauty, wit, and fortunes in an extravagant and wheeling stranger. Okay, so if you unpick that, the idea that there is this unnatural element to the relationship, that Desdemona has gone against the natural order of things, the societal order of things, and the familial order of things. She has kind of abandoned her family obligations and her blood ties. She has, you know, sacrificed her beauty. She has abandoned her wit, and she has disregarded all of her fortune attached to Brabantio to tie all of her obligation and honour and everything in with Othello, who is an extravagant and wheeling stranger, so untrustworthy, unknown, not like us. You know, what has Desdemona gone and done? He's an extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere. He doesn't belong. Othello does not belong anywhere, as far as these two are concerned. Straight satisfy yourself. If she's in her chamber, then you know, loose on me the justice of the state. Again, this conflation of public justice and private action. You have Brabantio saying that, you know, he had some sort of shadow, he had some foreshadowing, he had a dream of this. And then, practically speaking, once Brabantio's gone in, Iago reminds Rodrigo that he's got to go because he cannot stay. He cannot be produced against them all. He cannot have Brabantio saying, I was woken up by Iago saying this, because Iago's meant to be on Rodrigo's side. We get a little bit more sort of exposition because Iago knows that actually everybody's depending on Othello, because there is a problem brewing in Cyprus with the imminent Turkish invasion, and they need Othello, so they have none to lead their business. So this idea that there is a dependency and a great respect on Othello. And he says, though I do hate him as I do hell pains, for necessity of present life I must show out a flag and sign of love. So I'm going to carry on with the being what I am, not what I am. Ironically, obviously, the ancient that Iago is often a flag bearer, is there to give out a clear signal, and Iago is manipulating that. You then get Desdemona has been found to be gone. Brabantio says, you know, she's definitely gone. He considers his life now limited, that is such a blow to him. And all of a sudden, the thing that to note is, look at the difference in the way he interacts with Rodrigo. They are now united against Othello. They're united against this apparent aberration. And he kind of turns to Rodrigo as an ally, and he's got this kind of number of exclamations. And so he says, truly I think they're married. Brabantio refers to her behaviour as "O treason of the blood." And this mixture of apostrophe, exclamation and questioning shows the extent and the effect of his loss and his intense emotion. A couple of times, Brabantio has an address which is also kind of designed to the audience as well. Bear in mind, sort of patriarchal society. Fathers from hence trust not your daughters' minds by what you see them act. Okay, so a wider theme of the play as well. Can you trust what someone's saying to you? Can you trust what someone's doing? You cannot know people's actual internal thoughts. It's something that Othello says later, you know, that we may, you know, we can call these creatures ours and yet not their appetites. The idea that you can't trust people, in particular maybe you can't trust women. And Brabantio gets the idea that actually there is some sort of witchcraft at stake here, again, or at play here, again emphasising this idea of Othello's otherness, the suspicion of Othello. And then finally, you know, witchcraft or charms, they may be abused. Have you not read, Rodrigo, of some such thing? He's after some reassurance that this is not Desdemona's kind of doing after all. And here, you know, would you had her? So Rodrigo has gone from being the kind of nuisance joke suitor who's never going to marry his daughter to would you had her? Oh, if only, you know, I could have given her to you rather than her marry Othello. And they all decide they're going off to meet or to kind of hold Othello to account.